Hey guys, Stephen Cox here, and today I'm going to be going over some questions that I commonly get asked on Ubase. So just anything about the bass ukulele or the Ubase. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat today, because today is the time to answer these questions. And basically I'm just going to go over a few that I've gotten asked a lot, and maybe a few that aren't asked quite as frequently, but that people probably think about, that I just imagine people think of from time to time. So if you like videos like these, please hit the like button. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe, because I'll do videos like this, lesson videos, and I go live every Thursday if you like live videos. So let me know in the chat if you can hear me, if everything is loud enough or if it's too loud. And then we'll get started. So I'll go ahead and get started and just let me know. Hey, okay, cool. Well, thanks, Sherry. Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Jeff. All right. So I have a few questions here. I think I've written down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 questions. And then I just have some differences about strings. So I don't have like a specific question. I guess one of the questions I do get asked is which type of string is better? So I'm going to go ahead and start with that question and just give you reasons what each one is better for, because there's not really one that's better than everything. They're all good for different things. So I'm just going to talk about that. Hi, Betty Lou. Hi, Novix. Hi, Paul. So I'm laughing because I said how instead of hi. How. But anyway, the different strings, right? So what are each ones good for, and where do they fall short? So right now I'm playing the flat wound strings. So obviously the biggest advantage of these is sliding ability. Any string that you want to slide on, you can slide on. But there are a lot of advantages to each and disadvantages to each. So we've got the flat wounds here, super smooth, easy to slide on. We've got the round wounds, most like electric bass strings. So like if you have a bass guitar, you're more familiar with the round wounds, which have the ridges on the strings. And then we have the reason that Ubase was created in the first place, or the way it was created in the first place, having these polyurethane or rubber strings. So each one has its own advantage, and there are a few differences that we want to talk about. So a lot of people ask me which ones sound the most like, kind of like what you expect a Ubase to sound like, which is more similar to an upright bass than an electric bass. And that answer is pretty much exclusively the rubber strings. So there are different brands of rubber strings. I found the Pahoehoe, P-A-H-O-E strings to be the ones that sound the most like an upright bass if you were to compare them. However, I like the Thunder Guts because they have a little more punch to them, and I kind of like that attack. So in that sense, the attack makes it more like the kind of attack that you can get out of an upright bass. But in general, I think the Pahoehoes are the most like the upright bass strings, whereas the Thunder Guts have a little more punch to them. So they have more presence in some ways. But there are different advantages to each of those, but that's my answer, is the rubber strings overall, the polyurethane strings, sound the most like an upright bass. Okay. Now, if the question was which ones feel the most like upright bass strings, if you're talking about gut upright strings, probably still the rubber. But if you were talking about the kind of modern, most modern bass players have metal strings on their bass, and those metal strings happen to be flat wounds. So if you want one that feels the most like upright bass strings, I'd have to say it's the flat wound strings. So they're smooth and they feel the most like that. If you want ones that feel the most like your electric bass strings, you're going to go with the round wounds. So the round wounds are the ones, if you're used to that and you just really like that vibe, that's the thing. Okay. So I'm going to continue talking about the differences between these strings, and I also have a video comparing all three. So I'm going to try to do this briefly, but that is what I'm going over right now. So let's see. I made some notes here. Yes. So some people like to use a pick instead of their fingers. And so one of the questions I get asked sometimes is, which strings are the best for picking? And I'm not sure if I actually have gotten asked that, but I imagine people are thinking those. So to me, I have found that the flat wounds sound the best picked, and the round wounds are in a close second. So if you're trying to pick the bass rather than using your fingers, I would very much prefer the flat wound strings, because there's no friction. Like with the rubber strings, you'll get some friction going and it'll stop the pick, and it'll be hard to stay in time when you're going down, up, down, up. You might have to tilt the pick and change your technique. Whereas with these two, you won't have to change your technique because they'll feel like electric bass strings if that's what you're used to playing on. So if you use a pick, probably one of the metal options. And for me, I just prefer the flat wounds for that. They sound more like Paul McCartney's tone. If you wanted a more modern tone, you might prefer the round wounds for that. So like a modern like punk rock tone or something, these might sound better. Okay, which is the round wound strings, by the way. Alrighty. So, okay, so Betty Lou says, this goes with that question. Do you use felt picks, plastic, or metal? Well, that's another thing. If you use the felt picks, it probably would work better on the rubber strings if you were going to pick the rubber strings. But honestly, I use plastic most of the time. I feel like metal strings have too much of an attack, and it's just not quite the sound or the feel that I want. I almost get that feeling like it would have a tiny bit of that chalk on a chalkboard kind of vibe to it, just a little too abrasive. So I usually use plastic picks. But I imagine that the felt picks might actually work on the rubber, but I've never tried it. It might still create too much friction. But that's actually one I don't have the answer for today, because I don't have any felt picks to try that out with. Okay. So very cool, very cool. So let's keep going with the strings, though, real quick. So I'm going to stick with that first, and then I'm going to look at some of these other questions that have come up in the chat. So so as far as best ones for the picks, the metal strings. I wanted to mention that there are also nylon round wounds that Gali Strings makes, and those probably, just from playing them, would pick about as well as the flat wound or round wound. I didn't actually use a pick on them, and I don't have one with those, but they have a lot less friction, so they're going to be more like the round wounds would, where you'd probably be able to use a pick just fine on them. All right. So if you're doing the rubber strings, what are the rubber strings best for? Well, they definitely sound the most like an upright bass, and they have that classic sound that you want to hear. When you think of Ubase, they have that iconic sound, I guess, that you want to hear when you think of what makes it different. That's that. So so that's really the big advantage of them. There's another big advantage, though. If you have some wrist injury or something, like let's say you have carpal tunnel and it's just hard to move your hands and your fingers, or you have some arthritis, these are a lot lower tension than the other two strings, and you barely have to push down on them to hold the strings down. So it's a really big advantage if you're struggling with finger movement and dexterity issues and stuff like that. You probably want to go with the polyurethane, or also known as rubber strings, because they're just much easier to push down. So that part is much easier. So if the question was which one is the easiest to play on your fingers, it would definitely be the rubber strings for the left hand. And in the right hand, when you're plucking, that's a little bit different because the strings are a little bit sticky, right? So if you're in a humid environment, your fingers will stick to it a little bit. And sometimes if you're trying to play really fast passages, you might end up getting slowed down by your fingers sticking to the strings, and it might be harder to play as fast unless you play super lightly. And then you have to use more of the amp, and crank the volume a little bit more. But there are ways around it, but it's hard to go fast and consistently on the rubber strings. So the ones that, hold on. Okay, so the ones that that you can probably play the fastest on, I think, are just tied. Could be the flat wounds, could be the round wounds, but you can play really fast on them without having to worry about the friction. These technically have less friction, but honestly, the grooves provide side-to-side friction. So you're probably going to prefer the honestly, with that one, either way, the strings aren't going to slow you down. So I think that playing finger style works really well on the round wound and the flat wound metal strings. Also, I'm sure the nylon ones wouldn't provide too much friction either, so those are good too. All right, so we've got that. So we've got the we've talked about these are easier to slide on the flat wounds, but let's talk about one of the downsides of the rubber string. If you go to slide on there, sometimes depending on the string you're on and depending on if your fingers are, sticky from humidity or if you're in a really dry environment. But when you go to slide, if you slide on the metal strings, the note will stay in tune regardless of how far you slide. Whereas on the rubber strings, sometimes you'll pull the string with your finger and it'll bunch up some of the string that's vibrating, so it'll actually cause the pitch to be lower than intended. So sometimes if you slide to a certain fret, you might end up at a slightly lower pitch than you thought you would because of that string pull. So the easiest ones to slide on are definitely the flat wound strings. Okay. So when we talked about string tension, so as far as your left hand goes, the rubber strings are the easiest ones to play on. The second would be probably the round wound strings. And the highest tension string is going to be the flat wound strings. So they're just a little bit harder to push down than the other two. And that's just something important to note. Okay, and then we're going to talk about another one. There's a lot of string noise. So which string has the least amount of string noise? I think that's going to end up being the flat wound string has the least amount of string noise. Okay. So Betty Lou asked a question that's going to go with a it's going to be a follow-up question to another one that I have pretty soon, but it's related to string noise. So we'll probably just go ahead and do that one. So so if you want the least noisy strings and that's all you're concerned about, you're not trying to get the upright sound specifically and all these other things, the flat wound strings are going to be the least noisy. They're not noisy at all, but they don't have ridges. So when you slide around on them, you're barely going to get any sound and your fingers don't stick to them. So it really reduces string noise a lot if that's your only concern. And then, right. And so then that's another thing. Novix actually had a good answer to this. Try the Thunder Reds. So the Thunder Reds do have like a more kind of powdery surface. They don't stick as much. It's not like it completely gets rid of the string noise, but it does reduce the string noise a little bit. So the Thunder Reds are a good alternative if you want to stick with the rubber strings but have less. I still haven't gotten a chance to play on them, so I'm really just going by other people's answers on that. But I want to try the Thunder Reds for that reason. I've heard they also wear out a little bit quicker though, so that's just something to keep in mind. Okay. Have I ever used a capo on a Ubase, and if so, is it worth it? I have not, but that is an interesting thing. I have a capo. So we could try this out. I almost feel like if you're going to use a capo, it might be better to go from underneath rather than over the top. But we'll try both and see. Why not? So I'll go ahead and do that really quickly. But as far as powder, I have not tried using powder, but I've heard that it has worked for several people. I imagine that would lessen the string noise a good amount if your fingers are sticky, but that it's probably not a complete solution. So I do think that it helps. There's a video that there's a lady that was playing Ubase, and she had a whole bunch of different ways to reduce string noise, and she tried them out on the video, and one of them was dipping her fingers in water, which I don't really want to get water all over my Ubase personally, but she said that worked a little bit. And I think she tried some sort of powder, and I think that worked a little bit too. She tried out the Thunder Reds as well, and that was her favorite solution to the problem was the Thunder Reds. So hopefully that helps a little bit, but I can't remember her name, but it's like a music store, and there's this girl that plays bass, this lady that plays bass, and she does all those things. And so I thought that was a really cool test. And if you can find that video, you can probably find it just by searching something about Ubase string noise or something. You'll probably be able to find it just searching those kinds of things. Okay, so let me go grab the capo real quick. Real quick, meaning I take it back, guys. It's not where I thought it would be. So I may not be able to do the capo test, but I'm sure that the capo works. For me, there's not really a reason to use the capo unless you're doing a really like random arrangement. There just doesn't really seem to be a use for the capo. So I guess since I can't find the capo right now, let me check the desk and see if it just got buried. You ever have that fear of that you lost a capo? You know, I had one in my bass guitar case, and it may have fallen out. So I'm a little worried about that. But that is a great question. I don't feel like that you really need to use a capo because capos are for like chord shapes, and we don't really do a whole lot of open chords on there. So if somebody else has a capo, what I typically do to play along with them rather than capoing my instrument as well is I look at what fret their capo is on, and then I kind of put my finger where that fret is. And so then if I see them doing these other chord shapes, I can just go to whatever the lowest note is compared to that capo. So if it's 3 frets away, like it looks like the 3rd fret, if you pretended the capo was the open string, then that way you have this finger here kind of acting as a capo, although you don't need to push it down the whole time, but just as like a reference point so you can play the other notes. So to me, I don't feel like there's much of a need to use a capo. Or if you were using it, that you might just want to, you know, capo a couple of strings for a weird arrangement, like a crazy tapping thing or something. But honestly, I have a feeling that if you were to use a capo, it would be better to do it from the bottom to the top, since the strings are so thick, to make sure that you're actually getting pressure on the bottom strings going upwards. So in addition to that, that kind of reminds me of some of the other issues. If you haven't seen this Tuesday's video, a lot of people ask this one. This is probably the most frequent question that I get asked. I know I'm going in like a random order. I might try to like archive these later so that you can find the question that you want and the answer for it. But basically, this style pickup sometimes has issues with getting even pressure between strings, and this is more notorious with the rubber strings than the metal, because the metal tend to push down a little bit more. But a lot of times, one of the strings will end up quieter than the others, and so people are always asking, well, what can I do about it? There are a couple of things you can do. First thing is you can loosen the strings and try tightening them in different orders, just to try to get that on there. But then if that doesn't work, let me find the one I did it to. On the Ubases with this style pickup, you can actually just cut the pieces in between there, and you don't want to do it while it's on the bass or you'll end up cutting the pickup. So you have to take it apart, and that video that I did on Tuesday tells you how to do that. But you can even out the volume between the pickups, because basically what happens is if it's usually just one solid piece. So the string with the most tension, which is usually going to be the E string, is going to push down harder, and it's going to like kind of push the saddle, that white part down there that the strings are resting on. It's going to push the saddle kind of this way, right? Because it's pushing harder than the other ones are. So then your G string or one of the other strings may not be able to push down hard enough to have the pick it up at full volume. So it only partially picks it up. So the secret is you just cut these pieces apart where there already is a little gap between. You just cut it all the way through the saddle. So that's a very involved way to fix it. And if you have the time to do it, it's a great thing to do. But otherwise, I think that that your best bet may just be to try those other things about loosening the strings and tightening them in a different order. I think that's a last resort, considering that, you know, you can cut things wrong potentially. I didn't have any issues with that, and it is just a little bit frustrating taking it apart and piecing it back together. But that's a really common question, so I felt the need to do that, and that's the answer. Okay, so that's how you fix volume issues between strings. Let's see. I'm going to see if there are any other differences that I skipped over. I said that the highest tension strings, so these are the hardest on the hands, but they're easiest for slides. But they have the least string noise. Okay, so I think I covered everything there. So that the differences between the strings, I think y'all are good on that. And the Thunder Reds, I've heard that they wear out a little bit quicker, but they do reduce string noise. And I'm going to say this. This is a question that I'm not sure if it's really common, but how long do the strings typically last? I want to say that this bass ukulele is about 2 years old, and it's seen some heat changes and all sorts of things. There have been times where I've left it in the trunk on a hot day. I know it's terrible. I know people hearing that, you're probably cringing just knowing that I've done that. But it's ended up being a good test. And for the most part, the rubber strings are still good. These are still the original. So the polyurethane strings seem to last for years. But they're starting to get a little beat up on the bottom. They're starting to get little indentions where the frets are, and that might actually affect some things. So I would say that they probably have a life of about 2 years. And then the round wound strings, probably less than that, although I've had these on here for 3 years. So they aren't dead or anything. Like, you can still get harmonics to ring out and everything on them, but they aren't as bright as they were when they were new. So I would say with the round wound strings, you probably want to replace them maybe twice or 3 times a year rather than waiting 3 years like I have so far. But they can last for a really long time with a decent amount of playing. So that's just kind of a good thing to know. Oh, I apologize. Someone is calling. I'll call them back later. So so that's the volume issues, basically. Okay, so we got volume issues, string life. So the string life basically on this one, the flat wound strings, I don't know yet because I've only had these on here for a few months, but they're perfectly fine several months into having them. So I don't know how long they'll last, but they definitely last for months. So that's just something to keep in mind is string life. I imagine that the rubber strings seem to last longer unless you put them through really intense heat and cool, heat and dry areas. I've noticed some people have said that the Thunder Reds seem to wear out and get a little bit frayed or something a little bit quicker than that. So just something to keep in mind. And, obviously try to keep your Ubases and bass ukuleles in fairly moderate climates. Don't leave it out in 90-degree and up weather if you can help it, and don't let it get super duper cold and freeze or anything. But if you don't do any of those things, then typically they can handle the playing, because I play these things, some of them almost every day. Sometimes I have seasons where I like playing one more than the other, but yeah, they get a lot of playing and the strings last. So that's just a good thing to know. Okay. So I had this question recently and I feel like I'm going to get called out for this, but what type of batteries, and these are a bunch of dead batteries that I have right now, but they're the right kind. So there you go. So these are the CR2032 batteries. They're 3-volt batteries. They're watch batteries. And the typical Ubase takes 2 of these stacked on top of each other in a little sleeve. So this is one of the little sleeves. And here's another thing. If you have this kind of sleeve where it has this like little indentation on one side and the clip is on that side too, the part that, clips it into place. Sorry, you can't really see that. That's the side that you want the positive end of the battery to be in. I always forget which way they go in. So when you're doing that, put them in that way, and then you won't have to flip them out and reverse them when you realize they're facing the wrong direction. So just something to know. I know they don't always mark it clearly on the basic ukuleles. These aren't marked clearly at all. So hopefully that'll help you guys, unless it's an off brand that just has a different pickup for whatever reason. But yes, it's the CR2032 batteries, and so those are good. Thanks, Harris. I appreciate it. All right, so let's see. Another common question I get, can you slap on a Ubase? And the answer is yes. I think that slap on an electric bass will always sound a little bit better, but I have a few videos where I compare slapping on a full-scale electric bass to a Ubase with round wound strings and flat wound strings, just 2 separate videos. So here's what it sounds like on the flat wound. So that's kind of an idea. You can mess with the EQ. I'll flatten it out so you just get an idea. So that way it has a little bit more of that slap tone. Okay. And then I'm going to hopefully not hurt the amp too much. Oh, that's right. I don't have enough batteries to do this. I'm not going to change the batteries for all this. So I'm just going to do the acoustic version. Let me just plug this back in. Oh. And then, of course, the answer to which one does slap work the best on, I think I'd have to say the round wound strings. So the round wound strings are going to sound the most like an electric bass, and they're going to feel the most like an electric bass when you slap the strings. The rubber strings, you're probably not even going to be able to hear it acoustically. And so the biggest thing with the rubber strings is you can't pop the strings as hard or there'll be some buzz. So if I'm like popping them. And the other thing is the pop, because they're not metal strings, sounds more like a rubber band than a metal string would. And the metal will get that classic slap tone that people are used to hearing. So I think you can still slap on the rubber strings. It's just a little bit harder to do, and it's not quite the classic slap sound that people recognize. And you can slap on the flat wounds as well, but it's the same thing. The most classic slap sound is probably going to be what you'd get out of the round wound strings. So hopefully that helps. Okay, and then as far as what type of batteries, I do want to mention this real quick, going back to that question. Some of them run on 9 volts. So not very many, but you know, I have the battery wrapped because I was trying to figure out how to get rid of some rattle. It kind of worked a little bit, but I think it's actually the casing rattling in there. But anyway, this one uses a 9-volt battery. So basically, it also has like a different input. So you have like your normal output jack, and then you have this one that's like an XLR cable, which is like a microphone cable. Kind of strange. But I figured out when I was going through all this that some of the rattle was really happening from this just not fitting in properly. So the battery compartment was rattling. So that leads me to another point. A lot of people talk about things rattling on their bass ukuleles. It could be a lot of different things if you have a rattle on your bass ukulele. So I do want to mention that. Let's see. Can the round wounds be lubricated to be easier on the fingers while sliding? I wouldn't do that because I almost feel like lubricating it and then mixing that with your finger oil will probably corrode the strings over time. But basically the thing that makes it hard is the E string. If you're sliding on the E string, those ridges are so large that they just kind of like rip into your finger. And so I almost feel like they're so large that just lubricating them really wouldn't stop the effect of it. It might not like shred your finger quite as fast, but I would recommend not doing that, because the other thing is if you lubricate the strings, you're going to end up with gunk in between the ridges, and it's just going to make your strings go dead quicker. So that's my take on it. That's my theory. Like I said, I haven't done it. I feel like it's just not a really good thing to do. I know some people use on electric bass, on electric guitar, there's a thing called fast fret that people use. And I almost feel like that's such a slight thing that it might help, but due to the size of the ridges, it might still hurt to slide on these. So that's my opinion on it. It might help a little bit, but it's still not going to be very comfortable. But that's a good question. So I appreciate that question, Bob. But that's my take on it. Okay, and then somebody inevitably asks every now and then, are Ubasses loud enough to be heard in a band setting, or do they work like at a gig, like if you're playing with a band at a gig? And I have used the round wounds on a gig before a long time ago, and there were some issues with certain EQ ranges kind of missing that would have been there on the electric bass. So I'm sure you could get an EQ pedal and fix this, but it seemed like the controls weren't really enough to counter this at that particular gig. However, I feel like I have used the rubber strings at a jam before, and it worked great there. So I have a feeling that the rubber strings, surprisingly, might actually support those frequencies better and get a more even mix. So I'm going to say that yes, you can use them for gigs. You can use them for jamming with a band and, you know, with a drummer and everything. And they're mostly just like an electric bass, but that there was one thing where it fell short a little bit on one particular gig that I played on. And I think that was because the round wound strings, which is surprising. But maybe when you make the round wound strings that short, it's just hard to like retain all of that. Or maybe they didn't make them thick enough. It could be that too. But I had that issue of getting that to cut through on one gig, and it was called the Get Off the Grid Festival. It was like a festival run on solar panels. So you can actually find a little bit of footage from that gig. Like, I want to say it was about 3 years ago, because it was when I first had the Ubase, 2.5 to 3 years ago. Okay. So let's see. What have I not covered yet? Oh, when you're changing the rubber strings, somebody asked me a while ago, you know, they know that with the Pahoehoe, they recommend having the strings like go through and like you leave a lot of extra room so that when they pull, they go down. But I've noticed that most of the ones that I get with the Thunder Guts actually have the end of the string going down into that hole in the middle of the tuner, like you would do with other strings where you push it down and then you bend it a little bit so that it just comes around the side. And I found that when I took the strings off to do this adjustment and then put them back, that actually worked fine. So I'm thinking that the Thunder Guts don't have to stretch quite as much, but you still want to leave a little bit of extra so that you have enough time to go around the tuners, you know, a couple times. So that way, if they do stretch, you have a little bit of room to stretch. So you don't want to do it to where you only have like one loop around or something. So I would keep that in mind with the strings. But I believe the answer is yes. You can put the string down in the hole and do that. But I know that people don't do that with the Pahoehoe strings, the black strings. And I think that those need to stretch a little bit more. So I still don't recommend doing it with those. But I think with the Thunder Guts, it seems fine, because this one as well, the string is going down into the center there. So I think they did the same thing. But that was a question I got a while ago, and now I have an answer to it. So I thought I'd give you that answer. All right, does anybody else have questions? I know we had one about the Capo earlier. I wish I could find what happened to my Capo. They're always disappearing, I guess. In a minute, I might check one other place. But that's a good one. All right. So does anybody else have any questions? We'll just kind of go through there, and I'll try to think of some things. I think there was one question up here that I didn't answer, but just go ahead and ask more questions. All right. So I see Jeff asked, can you show a simple pattern CFG for early 59, 69 rock? Did you mean like 50s and 60s? It could probably be something with an arpeggio, like that kind of thing. And then you just move that around the pattern when you go to an F and a G. So if I just did like a CFG, not a 12 bar, but just a simple CFG, what I would do is I would do an arpeggio, and then I would add the 6th note of the major scale, and then go back to the 5th note. So if I was playing a C major scale, this pattern would be the 1st note of the C major scale, the 3rd note, the 5th note, and the 6th note. So we go root, root, 3rd, 3rd, 5th, 5th, 6th, 5th, root, root, 3rd, 3rd, 5th, 5th, 6th, 5th. And then you can move that same finger pattern just you're starting with your middle finger on the 3rd fret on the A string, so you could move that whole pattern down to the D string, right? So the only thing is you're going to run out of space because you don't have that extra string. So you just move up a whole step and then back down. So whole step is 2 frets up, right? And then when you go to the G chord, you could do the same thing. You're just going to start on a G with your middle finger, go back 1 fret and down to a thinner string, and then up to, this case would be the 7th fret. But if you had 4 fingers in a row, it would be where your pinky would be if you're doing 1 finger per fret. And then slide up a whole step to get that other note and then come back. So we've got, so that's the C pattern, F. And then you have the G, and then back to F and C. And then you could do something like a G at the end. So another thing about that, I don't really like shifting with my pinky like that. You could also play from a different version of the major scale where you do 3 notes per string. And so what I'm doing there is I'm doing the 3rd fret on the A string for C, and then I'm moving up to the 7th fret on the A string. That's an E note. And then from there, I can go to the 5th fret on the D string, and then the 7th fret, and then back to the 5th fret. So what I like doing there is sliding into the 7th fret. So you can think about it as the 3rd fret and the 7th fret, but when you move it around, that's not going to stick. So what I like to do here is, like, I'm starting with my pointer finger, and then I slide my ring finger from where it would normally be into the into a whole step above where it would have been. So, right, and then you got the 5th fret on the D string. That's where your pointer finger would now be after doing that slide, and then you're just going to go where your ring finger would be now after having done that slide, and then back. So 3 3 7 7 5 5 7 5. And that's the fret numbers. On the A string, 3 3 7 7. On the D string, 5 5 7 5. So that's the pattern. Then we just move that around. When you move it to F, you're just going to literally do the same thing, but on the D string and the G string instead of the A string and the D string. And then from there, you'll just go up to the 5th fret on the D string and do the same pattern starting from there. So notice that the fret numbers end up being 5 5 9 9, and then when on the G string, 7 7 9 7. So on the D string you have that 5 5 9 9. On the G string you have 7 and 9. Right. So so that's a pattern that you can use for that style. It's just the one that came to mind right now. There are other patterns too, but that one's really good for that blues rock kind of stuff, like Johnny B. Good and some other things like that. That's not the exact line from Johnny B. Good, but it works over it. And it's kind of a good default line if you don't know what the bass part does, but it has those chords in it. So hopefully that was good for you, Jeff. Let's see. So, oh yeah, the round wounds do get discolored on the frets. It's 2 things. So, Novik says that's just wear, and that is true. And the reason it wears down there is just the fret hits up against the string, and the strings are silver plated. So you're just kind of probably rubbing the plating off by playing the strings, and then the strings tend to roll under your fingers while you're playing a little bit, especially if you're bending strings. So if you do that, it'll end up all the way around, but mine are very worn. You can see it from there. Yeah, wow, you can see how worn that is. I have it up against the other string. That's not a shadow, that's the string wear. Yeah. So yeah, mine are very worn out, but it doesn't affect the sound. And that happened probably a month into having the strings. So that's something you can expect to happen pretty quickly, but the strings still seem to ring out in spite of it. So great question. And that was, let's see. Oh, and then I think it's Javier Gaming. Can you slap the double bass? You can. It's a little more painful, and it sounds a little different, but yes. Oh, and it also depends on what you mean by slap. There are two kinds of slaps. So can you slap the upright like an electric bass? The answer is still yes, but that's going to be the one that sounds a little bit different. And then you have the like bluegrass and rockabilly style slaps. So let me give you an example of both. See the bluegrass and rockabilly style first. If you're doing that kind of slap, it's like you're literally taking this part of your hand, slapping the strings, right? But then you can also do something kind of like popping on the bass, where you pull out with enough force to get the string to slap the fingerboard as well. We call it a fingerboard since it's fretless. Right? So you got that kind of thing. Right? So you can do that kind of thing. Or you could slap it like an electric bass. It's just harder to do, and you have to hit a little bit harder. And it wears you out very, very quickly. And you can get blisters on your fingers since you have to slap and pop a little bit harder. Yeah. And if you've ever seen Stanley Clark do it, he's a lot better at it than I am. So he did it once at a show that I was at, and it was just one of the coolest things I'd seen because he got a lot of attack out of it. But yeah, it's probably easier to do it kind of up higher rather than down low because you just have to hit harder to get the temps, since there's more tension there, to get the string to hit the neck. So about right here is probably the sweet spot. Ugh. All right. So that's not really a Ubase question, but it's fun anyway. And then you can kind of do upright style slap on the Ubase, which I did a bluegrass song that kind of did that too. And that one, I just kind of played really lightly. Because if you do it too hard, it might buzz. You know, that kind of thing. So you just play rather lightly. And when it's not plugged in, it's not going to work very well. Can any mini bass be considered a bass ukulele or no? Why or why not? Okay, so I don't consider them all bass ukuleles for a couple reasons. So one thing I really consider, the sound. If you're playing a bass ukulele, it's an instrument designed to fit in with some ukuleles. So I almost feel like I should be saying ukulele, but you know what I mean. If you use the rubber strings, the polyurethane strings, they kind of fit in with that nylon vibe a little bit better. So I do consider this, a true Ubase, a true bass ukulele. But when I play the metal strings, they are getting a little bit closer to just an electric bass, right? And I think one thing for me that really separates the difference is one thing that really separates the difference for me is the type of pickup that's used. So like the bass ukulele has the Piezo Pickup, and I know acoustic electric basses full scale also use that kind of pickup, but to me, a short scale one of those, and to me the really short scale ones qualify, but I mean honestly the thing that makes it a Ubase when it's a longer scale but doesn't have the metal strings, to me is that it is the rubber strings that makes it a Ubase in general. But if they're quite this short of a scale, then I like to consider them bass ukuleles, unless they're the solid body ones that have the style pickup that a electric bass would have. It's just more modeled after electric bass. But there is a lot of gray area there. So yes and no, but I consider them different because of the pickup style and because of the generally the size difference. So like when I see those gold tones that are larger, I almost don't consider those as bass ukuleles as much too. So I like the 20, 21-inch scale kind of thing going on from, from the nut to the bridge. But honestly, it's a little crossed over, because you could also argue that, before the Ubase existed, before the bass ukulele existed, there was an instrument called the Ashbury bass that had, I think, silicone strings. So it was the same idea, and it was short scale like a Ubase, but it wasn't considered a bass ukulele because there wasn't such a thing at the time. Okay, when they were first invented. All right, so then I guess that's most of the questions that I had on there. So let me see what else you got. How does the fingerboard on a cello compare to the Ubase? The cello and the upright bass, both of those together, they're just way more like spread out. So since it's a much larger scale, if you were to put frets on the upright bass, they'd be more spaced out than an electric bass. It's almost like the first fret on that would probably be this wide apart. The first fret on an electric bass would probably be more like that. And on a Ubase, it's probably more like that. So just the distance between them. So because of that, that changes the way that your positions are going to be. So an upright bass, I typically, if I was playing the distance from an F to a G, like the first fret on the E string to the third fret on the E string, I would typically go from pointer to pinky. On electric bass, I can do either. I can either do pointer to pinky or pointer to ring. On the Ubase, it's getting so small that I really have to cram my fingers in if I wanted to go from pointer to pinky. So I typically go pointer to ring. So that's the biggest difference, is the scale. The tension of the strings, there's going to be more tension on the upright bass. You're going to have to it's really like pulling the string into the fingerboard. But you're going to have to use more pressure. You're going to have to apply more pressure to get that to work. The cello is probably closer to the guitar. So its scale is still a little bit bigger than the Ubase, but not super huge. So it's not super huge stretches, but it would probably still, you'd have to stretch a little bit more. So that's the biggest difference. Another big difference, the fingerboard on a bass and a cello, an upright bass and a cello, their radius is enough to be bowed. So, they like, instead of a flat, like you picture a fingerboard that's basically flat. I know they all have a radius, but picture them as if they're flat, right? Well, on the upright bass, it's more like curved. It's more like this, so that when you're playing with the bow, you can get the different angles without hitting the other strings. Whereas since we're not playing these other instruments with the bow, there's not really much of a need for that. So their radius is almost non-existent. Like when you look at it, this one looks flat, like all the way across. That fingerboard looks flat if you looked at it from this angle. And on the upright bass, just to give you an idea, you can probably already see it. Oh, but let's see. If I tilt it like that, can you see how curved it is? I mean, even the bridge is curved, but the fingerboard curve matches the bridge curve. So that's the huge two differences that I would say. That, and of course, this whole part of the fingerboard floats off of the neck there, and does that on the cello as well. But those are just some differences. Let's see. Can you put rubber strings on a full scale bass or upright? Okay, so upright basses, there are gut strings, and so there might be a synthetic gut string now. And I don't know what brand makes the synthetic guts, but I'm sure there are synthetic gut strings. But the other ones are like animal gut, which is kind of weird, right? When you're playing on this, it's like you're plucking animal guts. Pretty weird. But I think they make some synthetic ones too. So if they make them for upright synthetic guts, then they probably have something, or someone probably has at some point made some rubber strings for full scale electric bass. The reason that it's harder to do probably is because the strings need to be thinner to be that long, right? Because to get the same exact pitch out of the string, the reason that our strings are so fat basically is because it's a shorter scale, right? Whereas on the upright bass, the strings are going to be a little bit smaller in diameter or in circumference, however you want to look at it. And yeah, so I have not seen any for electric bass. What I have seen is something called tape wound strings. And tape wound strings are going to be kind of like, they're going to have a steel or some sort of metal core, and then they're going to have this material around them. And so if it's tape wound, I mean, you could think of it kind of like tape, but it really feels more, not really rubber, but like almost plasticky. Maybe it's like the nylon kind of thing. I don't know, but it's a different material. And so it gives a different tone entirely. But I know that they make tape wound upright strings and they make tape wound electric strings. So those are kind of similar. But ones that are purely the polyurethane or rubber or whatnot and have no different core, it's just that solid material all the way through. I'm not sure if stretching it that far would work, but you definitely need to make them a different size to make that work. But yeah, tape wounds are pretty cool. So I know that Ron Carter is known for using the tape wounds on the upright bass. So that's a good, that's kind of like a good little thing there to know. But yes, I have not seen them, but I imagine someone has probably done it. I mean, if they have the ones for the 23-inch scale, you know that they can make them bigger, because I know that the micro bass, the gold tone basses, they have bigger ones that have the same kind of string. So yes, someone probably has. The downside to that is the kinds of pickups that you have on electric bass probably won't pick up the sound from the rubber strings. You're picking up the vibration, but you're picking up the metal string vibrating, right? So I kind of wonder if it would pick it up at all. So you might have to have the same kind of pickup that you have here, a piezo pickup installed on the bass that picks up the vibration through the physical solid, really through the bridge or through something. But yeah, it would have to do that. Okay, so I'm gonna mispronounce the name. Is it Betaraba? Anyway, the question that you have is it possible to use piccolo bass strings on a Ubase? This kind of goes in that same question or the same answer I was just giving for this about how thick the strings are. I imagine piccolo bass strings would be so thin that you wouldn't be able to get as low of a pitched sound if you use piccolo bass strings. So I don't even think you could get the way they'd be tuned on a full scale bass. They'd get too loose and kind of flop around by the time that you try to tune them there. So if you were trying to tune it more like a guitar or higher pitch than that even, then they might work. But the big downside is they're still going to have a metal core. And even these metal strings have a nylon core. So I think your best bet is to not have a string with a metal core, because it might put too much pressure on the tuners, and it might put too much pressure on the pickup. So or on the saddle and on the bridge. So I would not try to do that with the piccolo bass strings. It may theoretically be possible, but to me, it just doesn't seem like a good idea to try it. Okay, so then neck or something not strong enough question. That kind of goes along with that question about trying not to use the metal core strings on the bass. That sometimes, yes, the neck might not be strong enough. However, most of these have a truss rod going through the neck, so they do have a little bit of extra support. Oh, okay. You mean the flat wounds or the round wounds, Alan? Because I have seen plenty of people do the round wounds on it, but the flat wounds I've heard that they don't. They're a higher tension string, so it's a similar concept of any string that has a higher tension is going to put more pressure on different components. So I've seen people do round a lot, and I'm sure that you're not really supposed to. It's the same thing. The reasoning behind it is you're putting a lot of pressure on the bridge and on the pickup, and on the solid body basses, they have a different design, right? It's not solid with the instrument like this. It's like raised up on a little platform. And so the idea is those rounds, and I think rounds are fine. I think flats, it's just they can work, but they have damaged some basses. So it's kind of like you're really taking a gamble with the flat wounds. The round wounds, like Keith is saying, he has them on his 5-string. Maybe over time they might slowly damage it, but I almost feel like I've heard it more about the flats than the rounds. But just the type of pickup that you have, it's the more tension you put on it, the more pressure you put on it, the more wear it's going to put on those materials down there. So it's potential, you know, it's not designed to hold that much tension, whereas these are just a solid piece of wood. And, you know, if the pickup's a little, it's like, I don't know, if you break something there, it's probably cheaper to replace too. But yeah, they're just not really designed to hold that much tension, to have that much pressure on them. Yeah, so that is the thing. I think that you could theoretically do it, but there is a risk involved, and they don't want to have the liability of you getting mad at them, coming back to them and saying, you said this could work and it didn't work, you know. But I know a lot of people that do have the round wound strings. So if anybody's put some on there after the fact, it may be that they do something extra just to alleviate some of that pressure. I don't know for sure, but I know that the flat wounds have, you know, like I was saying, the flat wounds are the highest tension string. Then the round wounds are a little bit less. But I have seen a picture or two in the Ubase Freaks Facebook group of some damage done to one of the solid bodies from trying to put those strings on there. They may have been the flat wounds though, because that was my ultimate goal, was to have a solid body Ubase that was fretless with the flat wound strings. And then my other goal was have one look as much like an upright as possible and put the flat wound strings on it. So this is kind of related to everything here too. This bass ukulele, as much as I like the way it looks, and I finally fixed that volume issue down here, my next step is really to try to put flat wounds on here, but I'm a little scared to, and I'll tell you why. It doesn't have a truss rod. Like you can see, there's no place for a truss rod, right? You couldn't access it from here, and there's no covering on here, so there's no truss rod. And I asked them to on Amazon, and the company said, no, there's no truss rod. So I'm afraid that when I put those strings, because that high tension, that it could theoretically just warp the neck. So it probably won't break it in half or anything, but it really could warp it. And warping it, you know, it could mess it up enough to where the action ends up this high, or just all sorts of things could go on. So I'm a little nervous about doing that, which is why I've been trying to make a whole bunch of videos about the fretless bass ukulele. But yeah, and that's another thing. So the fretless bass ukulele versus the fretted bass ukulele. A lot of people ask me about the differences there, and I tell them the main difference, and you know, I made a video on this too, but just a brief main difference between fretless and fretted is that your ear has to be really good to play the fretless, because it's almost like, and you know, don't take offense to this if you prefer fretted, it doesn't mean anything, but if you were trying to get to where you could play fretless, you could consider the fretted like training wheels. That, you know, they're always going to keep you in tune if they're set right. You know, the note's going to be in tune, and it's going to be very consistent. Well, in here, your finger has to be very consistent because there's no frets. So you can play any of those. Oops, something's rattling. I think it's that battery again. Let me see. Yep, it was the battery. Once again, you can kind of hear it. It moves in and out and slides side to side. So I'm going to figure that out. It's not just around the battery, but the compartment itself. I'm going to have to. Anyway, with the fretless, if you don't have fret markers like this one on the front doesn't have the lines where the frets would normally be, then your ear has to be good enough to figure out where that is. And even if it does have the lines, if you're slightly in front of the line, slightly behind the line, and that means the point of contact on your finger, right? So like, let's say your finger flattens out when you play, and all of a sudden that makes your point of contact over here instead of the middle of your finger. Well, then you're going to be sharp on every note you play when you're trying to play on the lines if you don't realize that, right? So it's little nuances can make a big difference with pitch. And then this one has dots on the top to help you know where you are. So this is about where the third fret would be. And you might notice that it's a little further down the neck than you'd expect, a little further away from the nut than you'd expect. That's because the dots have to be exactly where the piece of metal would be. You play right on where the fret would be, right on the line, right on the dot. So the dots aren't in the middle of the fret like you'd have here. Let's see if that's true or not. If I can't put them face to face because the dots are only on one side. But you can tell if I line the nut up that this dot is higher up than this one. Does that make sense? So like it's up here, which would be the equivalent of there instead of down here, because that would be in the middle of the fret, whereas this is right over where the 3rd fret, the piece of metal right here, would be. So that's a big difference about it, is that you're playing right on the line, you're playing right on the dot, you know, because your finger is the fret. Your finger's the thing shortening the string to it. What's the advantage of it? Well, obviously slides are awesome on fretless because there's nothing stopping you. So you can just slide all the way up the neck, slide all the way down, and it's a really smooth sounding thing. The other thing is you get the sound that's your finger slightly mutes the string just ever just a little bit. So if you like that kind of slightly muted sound, you get that naturally with the fretless. And you almost hear more of the wood tone because you're pushing it down against a piece of wood instead of a piece of metal. And so it's wood and skin that are combining to make the point of contact rather than a piece of metal. So it just changes the tone a little bit. And a lot of people like that more natural tone. And sounds a little bit more like the upright bass for that reason. So that's like the big difference with fretless. And it takes a lot of adjusting and really getting your ear in tune with stuff rather than just relying on looking down at your finger, because otherwise you'll be looking down at your hands the entire time. And honestly, it just takes a lot more practice for that reason. But it's still accessible. If you have a decent ear, you can still do it. It's just a matter of training your hands to go where they need to and using your ear to micro adjust. Okay, so I think that's pretty much all the questions that I kind of remember being asked. And I'm glad that you asked about the round wounds and flat wounds being put on the solid body, because that one is a big question that gets asked a lot too. I'll eventually get a solid body and then I can do these things and, you know, maybe even do the trial and error kind of thing where if it breaks, I can explain why they tell you to do the risk and like show an example instead of just telling you. But yeah, that's their thought process with that. So what I'll probably end up doing if this one doesn't work very well with the flat wounds, and I don't know if I want to try to break it or not that way, because I think it might break it, really might mess up the neck a lot. So what I might end up doing is getting another fretless bass ukulele, like maybe the Ebony model, because that one's really cool, and put the fretless on that. And then a 5-string solid body. Are they still making those? I know they were making those for a while, and those were really cool. So I might be able to get a used one. I know that they there were a few models that were cheaper where they had the 5-string. But yeah, I'd love to try that out and see if there's any difference with the strings. If you can get a string pack with the low B versus getting one with a high C, I think, you know, that would be really cool to see the difference if they have both those still. But that's one downside to that 5-string is like if they stop making them, then they'll stop making string packs probably too. And so then what do you do if one of the strings breaks? So, but yeah, I like the idea of the 5-string because I think it would be fun to play. I made a video of me trying to play some Dream Theater on the 4-string. And, you know, I had to do the stuff that was down on the B string up an octave. So that would be kind of cool to have the 5-string, and I'd probably enjoy it a lot. But yeah, those are the most common questions that I get asked. If you have any other ones I just like didn't cover here, it's not that I'm like, you know, not wanting to answer them. It's that I'm racking my brain trying to come up with the ones that I'm used to hearing. There are probably several that I haven't covered. So you have the tenor with the high C string, but do they still make the 5-string packs with the low B? Because that I'm still curious about. Do they even make those anymore? So Robert asks, have you had any opportunity to try a short scale electric bass? If so, how does it compare to the Ubase? There was one at NAMM. I didn't get to plug it in. But basically this company just made a tiny version of one of the basses that they had, and the scale ended up being almost the same as a Ubase, if not the same. And it had a different pickup. What I would imagine is that it would sound more like a little electric bass. And I tried to convert a first act guitar to a bass one time, where I took the bridge off of the first bass I ever owned that had broken and, you know, put that bridge on there and then put strings on it and tried to connect them to just, you know, the outer tuning pegs of the thing, and then I think I may have had to replace the nut, or I may have just made new slots in there for the 4 strings. And it had a built-in amplifier, which is why I wanted to do that. And it kind of worked, but I had the issue of I didn't have the thicker strings. So to answer your question, I've done that, and that was just like it wouldn't hold the low pitch as well. But I haven't really played one plugged in that's had the strings sized right like this. So I imagine it wouldn't be much different than playing the round wound strings. It would just have a totally different tone because of the different, the magnetic pickup rather than the piezo pickup. So I've played some that are slightly shorter scale, like a 3/4 size bass, and but not one that's quite as small. So if you're talking about the ones that are kind of in between, I have played those, and they're a lot more like a full-scale electric bass with just slightly lower tension, so you can bend easier, and you just got to be careful not to accidentally bend a little bit when you're pushing down, because that might cause the notes to go out of tune. But that's the idea. So Keith, you say if Kala quits making the rounds, I'll go back to Pahoehoes. Okay, well if they do, you could just buy a whole bunch of packs, just to have like 3 or 4 packs or something, just on hold. I don't know how long the packs last for you. Like I said, I got 3 years out of my strings. So if you got that, and it will last you about 10 years if you did it like I do, and you don't mind that they look worn out. All right, so let's see. Any other questions? If so, how does it compare to Ubase? Okay, I'm going to continue on that. The main difference would just be the pickup, and maybe if the strings had a steel core versus a nylon core, the round wounds might sound different and react different, because I think the round wounds on the Ubase almost have a hollow sound, and I feel like that hollow sound is really coming from the nylon core rather than having a solid core underneath. So I imagine that the tone would be a little bit more like a full-scale electric bass or a short-scale electric bass, the 3/4 rather than a Ubase. But they're fairly similar. It would just I'm trying to think. Yeah, I was gonna say if you put the rubber strings on there, it probably wouldn't sound different at all, but the pickup might not pick those up at all, because you kind of need metal for a magnetic pickup to pick up the vibrations, I think. So just in case y'all are wondering why these use the piezo pickup rather than having the like magnetic ones that you see on bass guitars, I think that's just because the string material doesn't get picked up, So that's the same thing. What are your thoughts on the Musa fretless bass? So this one, right? So everything I've said about it, it's been pretty good, but there's a random rattle that I've been trying to get out of here, and I think the random rattle is coming from the fact that it uses a 9-volt battery rather than than 2 watch batteries, and just the design of this thing. It rattles when I play like the open D string, but if I hold that part in, if I just literally hold where the battery is, it doesn't rattle nearly as much. But there is something else rattling on there too now. So my opinion of these is there's a definite jump from the quality of construction of this compared to a Kala. A Kala will just have a better build. It won't have those random rattles. I mean, I did have a little bit of a rattle with the exotic mahogany, and I finally figured out that was the back plate just getting demagnetized. So when I play it now, I just leave the back plate off, and that's tended to solve that problem. But that's the only problem I've had with those. Whereas this one, there's just been a lot of little things. I think when I made the video about just recently, Tuesday, about cutting the saddle so that the sound is more even, I think I realized too, just looking at it, I put the saddle on backwards. I think they're supposed to be facing the other way. Interesting. So that might actually change the angle on some of those, but I haven't noticed anything wrong with it, so I'm not going to take it off because that was just a pain in the butt. But yeah, so shove a little piece of foam. I mean, honestly, I thought it was the battery itself, So what I did was I wrapped it in toilet paper. I was thinking about just shoving some toilet paper right in between there and that, and maybe just one layer or something back behind it. But it could also be that it's not quite making the connection that it needs to against there. But yeah, I'm gonna do something like that. But yeah, foam or toilet paper, one or the other. But yeah, so that's the idea there. So let's see, what are your thoughts on this one? Okay, that was the question I was just answering. So basically, yes, it's pretty good overall, but it doesn't have a truss rod yet again, so I'm afraid to put flat wounds on it, although I might still. And this one's weird because it came with this sticker that says like Jacques or something, but it was definitely the Musa or one. It's just a sticker. Like, see it peeled off. I'm probably gonna take the rest of it off now after that just broke off like that. But I don't know why they stuck the sticker on there. I looked it up now, and it doesn't have a sticker on there at all. It's just blank. So silly little things like that happen, and I don't really understand the thought process if that was private labeling or something weird. I don't get it, but it was strange. But overall, it's been pretty good. I mean, you can see it used in the video with the comparing it to the upright, comparing it to the fretted bass, and I did that unboxing video, but hopefully that gives you some more answers on it. But it's been okay, but it's definitely like Capo is a step up from that brand. Yeah. But for the price, it was okay. It just took a long time for it to get here too. And I imagine with all the stuff that's gone on since then that it would take even longer to order one now. Can you put round wounds on any Ubase? It's because I have a kind of cheapo one, and I'm not sure if the neck would resist the tension. Okay, so yet again, does it have a truss rod? If it has a truss rod, I would say you're probably fine. If it's like this one and it doesn't have a truss rod, I really can't answer you until I try to put any of those strings on here. Oh, and here's another, let's see. Oh, thank you. Is it Caro or Caro? Caro? Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I try to keep them as informative as possible. There are a lot of things I still don't know. I'm just kind of like experimenting with stuff. But when I figure stuff out, I try to let you guys know. Okay. And so then to finish answering that question, can you put round wounds on any Ubase? The round wounds, like we just talked about earlier, some of the solid body Ubases, they were saying not to put them on there. And then any bass that doesn't have a truss rod, I would say I would be wary of doing it. You are risking, that extra tension warping the neck. So if it's a risk, but I've never done it on the really cheapo ones, so I really couldn't tell you. But yeah, if it has so here are the two things you'll see. Whoops, where's my? There we go. Just unplug it so you can see us. Up here, this one has a truss rod, and the way you get to it is you unscrew these little screws, and then there'll be a little place that you can adjust the truss rod underneath that little cover, right? And then on the other ones, if you have a sound hole, just like a round sound hole, you'll have access through the sound hole. Do you see how like underneath the strings, there's a little circular thing that you can put a Allen key in? You can kind of see it there. So if it has those, yeah, that's the truss rod. I feel like if you have that, you're probably okay as long as you have this kind of bridge and this kind of saddle with the because the solid body ones, they've tended to say don't do that with them, is what we just found out from another comment today. But if you have this kind of setup where it's basically like this kind of saddle with the that looks kind of white like this or cream colored, and then it has little black caps on the end and stuff like that. I imagine that pickup and this kind of bridge where it's a solid piece rather than something raised up. Yeah, it should be able to support them if it has that, as long as you get the ones that are made for Ubase. So don't put like full scale electric bass string round wounds on there, or the metal core might be too much for the tuners and for other components. But if you're doing the nylon strings, I think that it should be fine. The ones designed for it. Yeah, so Kala makes them. And then there's another brand that makes some too. If you guys know the other brand, you can put them down there. I know Golly Strings has some, not metal, but nylon, where they're like, so not only is the core nylon, but it's also nylon round wound around it. which is what makes the ridges. So yes, I would not do normal electric bass strings because they're just designed for a longer scale as well. So getting the pitch low enough, you'd have to have the string loose enough. And if the string was super loose, it would just like flop around or something. Pahoehoes are the pahoehoes are rubber. Those are rubber strings. Dario makes one for the Taylor GS Mini with nylon core and bronze wrap. That's cool. I don't know if it would work on here because the those are still a larger scale. So when you have it on the smaller scale, you might have to have the strings so loose that they might still flop around too much. I mean, the GS Mini is what, like, that's like maybe the nut would be further up here. Do you know the scale length on that? And shotgun loops, that's I think it's Adam, right? Anyway, Alex, 24-inch scale. So that's a 4-inch longer scale. And yeah, so that 4-inch longer scale, because these are like basically 20-inch scales, just it might make a difference. It might still be doable. You might still be able to get the pitch out of there, but I would just go with the ones. They're not really that expensive. I would just go with the ones that are made for the Ubase. If you have a shorter scale one, if you have a longer scale one like the what are they called? Gold Tone. The Gold Tone 23 or whatever. I think those are a 23-inch scale. I imagine that those strings that Shotgun Loops is talking about would work there. But otherwise, I would just go with, you can go with these other options probably, and they probably would work. Cool, it does work for the Gold Tone. That's good to know because I don't have one of the Gold Tones to test that out on. So awesome. So thanks for letting us know that. We're answering more questions. Do the Taylor GS Mini strings work on the Gold Tone? Yes, they do. Awesome. Cool. And I've played a Ubase that had those, probably those strings on it, unless another brand is making pretty much the same strings. And they played just fine. They were just a little bit looser tension. So, so yeah, I kind of like that. They felt very comfortable. So very, very cool. So does anybody else have any other questions, or did I skip any questions? But yeah, as far as strings go, just get the ones that are designed for the instrument that you're doing, because there might be some slight things like that might make a big difference. Awesome. I'm glad you landed here and got answers to your questions. If you got more questions, let me know. I think that's about it for tonight, unless another question or two comes in before I finish saying, bye or something. But if you have more questions, you can always leave them as comments below in the video after on the replay, and then I can get back to you at least in comment form that way. And I always appreciate all these questions because honestly, they make good separate videos too. Like the person that asked about when I say the person, like the 10 or 20 people, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, maybe it's only 5 or 10, that asked about fixing the volume levels between the strings. Led to the video of doing this and led me to have the confidence to try to cut my Ubase apart a little bit. But yeah, but thank you so much for hanging out. I appreciate you guys being here, and I hope I answered as many questions as I could for you guys. And if there are any that you're still wondering about, let me know in the comments below. Who knows, maybe on a future live stream, I'll find my capo and be able to give you a better answer on the capo. I imagine it works. You probably just want to do it from underneath. Thank y'all so much for hanging out, and I will see you guys next Tuesday for a normal video and next Thursday for the live stream. As of right now, I'm planning to do every Thursday for the live stream. If I randomly get a show on a Thursday night, they are back here in Georgia. We do have gigs here, and then I might not do on those nights, but I'll let you know the prior week if that happens. So far, every Thursday. Can I build a solid body fretless Ubase with no truss rod if I put rubber strings on? I mean, I think some of the solid bodies don't have truss rods. So I think the answer is going to be yes on that, but you would definitely want to use the rubber strings for it. So if you want to have more options, I'd probably figure out how to do a truss rod. And if you're okay with not having as many options, then I believe the answer is yes, because, this is a good example. No truss rod. And I believe that somebody told me that was part of the problems, and it may have been mentioned even in this comment thread as well, that that was one of the problems with the solid bodies, is they don't have truss rods typically. Okay. Do you notice any output volume difference between the Journeyman and your other Kala? I don't remember which one it is. One of these puts out a really strong volume, and I imagine it's this one because of the 9-volt battery. Just puts out a stronger signal. And but with the other Kalas, I think they're pretty even. Honestly, I haven't noticed any difference. That's a good question, Robert. But yeah, to answer your question, I haven't noticed any difference. But you've got 10 seconds if one goes through before there, and otherwise I'm signing out for tonight, and I'll just answer these questions next time. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, guys, thank you so much. I will see you next week, Tuesday and Thursday. Tuesday for the video, Thursday for the live stream. Have a good week and stay safe and all that jazz, and get out and vote if you're in the United States. And that's as close to political as I'm going to get. All right. Bye, guys.